light pollution. So you basically can't see the night sky anymore. This can be compared to how an autistic experiences a neurotypical world. It's all polluted with noise, smells, too many visuals, people, and all of that. And that's very stressful. Non-compliance is not a disorder. It is self-advocacy. Compliance is not the goal. Letting go of control and rethinking support for autistic individuals. Instead of trying to control the behaviors of individuals with autism to make them indistinguishable from the general public.
I encountered many concerning themes. Children with autism are like empty fortresses. You have to break down walls to reach them. They are unfeeling. They live in emotional blindness. And there was one concerning theme that I kept encountering over and over again. And it was put forth by Dr. Ivar Lovaas, who was considered to be the preeminent authority on educating children with autism at the time, using behavioral principles. And this theory was that when you were working with a child with autism, you were starting from scratch. You had a child in the physical sense, hair, ears, nose, eyes, but not in the psychological sense. You had to build that child. And often to build that child in scaffold development, you had to strip away interfering behaviors. Now, you can imagine that I was quite concerned and wondered what I had gotten myself into. And I was also extremely curious as to what my qualifications as a new grad were for child building. So there was some trepidation when I went to my first day of work and I was about to encounter my first client. I look across the waiting room and there sits Corey, surprisingly looking like a whole child. Now, before I can even say hi to Corey, I'm whisked to the side of the room by his behavioral therapist and handed a behavior management plan. And in this plan is a list of all the things he's not allowed to do. Jumping, spinning, flapping his hands, silly talking. And all I can manage in that moment is why? Why can't Corey do these things? And the answer comes back at me super fast. They are autistic behaviors. They are stims. They are non-functional and they're disruptive. We actually use this token board to encourage him not to engage in them. She handed me the token board, she handed me the behavior plan, and we went into our session. Now, what you need to know is this environment we entered was like a giant playground. There were inflatable cushions, there were slides, swings. We're talking fun. Corey and I started to play. And as we played, we jumped, we crashed, we spun, we laughed, and it was really apparent that I was not good at inhibiting forbidden behaviors when I was actually engaged in them myself, because I was lost in play. It also was really evident to me that every time Corey got excited, he would jump and he would flap and he would jump and he would flap and he would giggle every single time. And I would say, "You look so excited." And the behavioral therapist would say, "Quiet hands." And I would go, "His hands are quiet. This doesn't make any sound." Okay. So it should come as no surprise that I was relieved of the token board and the responsibility for implementing that behavior management plan before the session even ended. So every time a behavioral therapist would come into a session with me, I'd ask the same question: why does the child engage in these behaviors? And the answer was always the same: because they have autism. And I would counter with, well, that's pretty circular, because they only qualify for a diagnosis of autism because they engage in these repetitive, restrictive, and stimmy behaviors. This focusing on extinguishing on getting rid of autistic behaviors formed the bedrock of almost all of my clients' educational programs. This was pretty uncomfortable for me because, as I said, while they looked slightly different from the norm, like Corey jumping and flapping every time he got excited, they appeared functional. And this idea that you could fix a child or these behaviors were problems harken back to that early reading I did that viewed autism as something different and something deficient. Now, the voices of autistic adults are very clear in telling us this approach to extinguishing autistic behavior is flawed. In fact, you can't change underlying neurological differences by simply getting rid of some behaviors. You can't uncover a hidden neurotypical child by extinguishing hand flapping. So we have mounting evidence that tells us that these behaviors are the result of differences in sensory processing, differences in social communication, and neurophysiological differences. They're risk factors. And these risk factors are best understood in listening to the voices of individuals with autism.
Can you explain a little bit to my listeners about your own autism journey?
Sure. So the first thing I think that's important to know is that as a child, I was undiagnosed. I was one of those girls who could mask really well, and I could kind of go along to get along, and I was missed. So I was not diagnosed. I always had this sense of being different, but I actually never realized I was autistic or diagnosed as autistic until I transitioned into my first full-time job. So I consider my journey to really have only started about 2 years ago.
Okay.
So it was a complete environmental shift, and it wasn't more than, I would say, 2 weeks into that job when I started coming home, and I was either so explosive, I was throwing things, I was kicking my feet through my door, breaking things, or I was the opposite. I would come home and I'd need to sit in complete darkness and silence, and I'd end up sleeping for 18 or 22 hours. And it was during this time that I was like, what is going on? Am I depressed? Do I have anxiety? Is this depression? I would have check-ins with myself, very realistic check-ins of like, am I suicidal? Do I still have hope? Do I want to be doing this? Because for me, it was like the best part of my life must be over. This is what the world is like, and I obviously can't do it. So I felt very incompetent, and I had no idea what was going on. So I also had no inclination to reach out to another person to try to help me figure it out. That kind of mutual regulation piece was not really in my repertoire at this point. But finally, I did tell someone after months. I think this was in November or December, and it was Amy, who has been featured on your show.
Great.
And she has, the occupational therapy background, the autism background, developmental psychology. But in the beginning, we were really focusing on this as my sensory differences. And then as we worked through some of my challenges and the way my mind worked and my childhood, we got, we dove deeper into my life. It came out, it was like, oh my God, I am autistic, definitely autistic. And I could math with the best of them. I understood what I was supposed to be doing, but not necessarily why or the reasons behind it or the expectations. So it was at that point that my journey really started, and I'm still on it. I'm learning about myself. I'm looking back at my entire life with this new lens of awareness and understanding that has been really empowering for me. And it's why I can cope now and why I still have the job that I have. But I know when it's coming, and I know I know when I need to put more supports in place for myself, and I also am much more aware of when I just need to take time to be completely on my own, downtime, recovery, take some time off of work, and just make sure I fully recover so that I'm not trying to catch up and getting to that point of explosivity or complete shutdown.
Okay. So I suppose it's definitely around understanding yourself better, and regardless of whether you become dysregulated or not, it's about understanding yourself and knowing when or how to support, when these things are going to happen, or how to best support yourself to perhaps prevent that point of dysregulation.
Exactly. And even just having the name, knowing I am autistic, is so different from becoming dysregulated and not understanding why. Because when you don't understand how you're different, you think, if everyone else can do this, why am I incompetent? So just that different frame of mind and the knowing the lens through which I view and experience the world is so powerful.
Perfect. Jacquelyn, what kind of changes do you think need to be made at a societal level in order for us to move away from the idea of forcing compliance on autistic individuals and instead becoming a more emotionally regulated society?
I think it really starts with an understanding of what it means to be autistic. I think there are large segments of the population that really still don't understand or have very stereotyped views of it. So kind of like we've touched on before, that exposure, talking to autistic adults, keeping autistic kids in a classroom as much as possible, hiring autistic adults, and letting autistic people be open about it will give the public a better understanding. I think that's an important first step, because I think it's hard for people to get away from behavior modification and compliance if they believe something is just a tragedy, or that autistic people want to be just like everyone else. And then I think changes at a governmental level for the types of supports and educational practices used in schools, I think that also needs a serious change. And so when compliance and behavior management is the only recognized form of support for autistic kids, it's also really hard to work around that sometimes when you're talking about getting things paid for by insurance or implemented at a large level. So definitely those policy changes are needed as well.
Absolutely. And
start off with, this man needs no introduction, and then promptly introduce him. So those of you that know and have had the privilege of listening to Luke before, don't need him introduced, but this is Dr. Luke Bearden. Some of you may know him from our resources and our library, but not have actually met him before. So this is a rare privilege, and thank you very much, Luke.
That's why I use the term predominant neurotype. Absolute rejection of the term disorder. Bone of contention with me and Axia ASD, but never mind. And I know they don't approve, and I know there's all sorts of legal reasons. I don't like ASC either, as in condition. You're not a condition, you're a human being. I'm sure you know that. You don't have a condition either. You are autistic. Well, that's my view. You might feel differently, which is absolutely valid as well. But that's just from my point of view. And I use identity first, so autistic rather than a person with autism. I don't think it's an add-on, it's an intrinsic part of you as a human being. And I don't think we should be trying to change that. I think we should be trying to change all sorts of things that surround that, like anxiety and all of those sorts of things. But I'm absolutely 100% convinced that autism does not equate to anything apart from being autistic. So when people say, oh, if you're autistic, that must mean X, Y, and Z, you can say, not necessarily. It means I'm autistic. That's it. So when I know people who have been rejected from CAMS, for example, say, we can't do anything about anxiety, it's because you're autistic. No, it's not. Being autistic does not equate to being anxious. Otherwise, every single autistic person would be anxious, and that's not the case. It's environmental factors alongside you as a human being that cause the anxiety. So if that outcome is anxiety, and you agree with that equation, you don't have to, but you should because it's right, and we acknowledge that you can't change being autistic, which you can't, then the only thing left to change is the environment.
All my years running the world's largest membership organization for adults on the spectrum, I certainly got it that this was all a two-way street, that the rest of the world had a lot of work to do, and that we had some work to do as individuals on the spectrum. I don't know what that percentage is between the two of how much work needs to be done, but I do believe firmly that from our end, that 90% of our problems as adults in life are caused by an inability to manage our challenges for emotional regulation.
So as we make this shift to emotional regulation, we form a partnership in which we help scaffold skills and abilities so that individuals are able to regulate their emotions and deal with the risk factors that they have. But also a partnership that recognizes that we need to make accommodations to the environment so they're not so overwhelming or activities. And it's within the context of this partnership that our question starts to transform. It's not just a question of why anymore, but now it becomes a question of how.
So society spends an enormous amount of resource, and by resource I mean time, energy, money, into changing autistic people, trying to change autistic people. Which doesn't work. You can't make anybody less autistic. You can make them appear less autistic if you really want, which is a very cruel, I was going to say cruel and unusual. I wish it was unusual. It's a very cruel way of going about things.
Behaviors may then be squelched and trained out of us. The sense that mom, therapist, or society wants to fix me, and not really seeing our personhood.
To control those emotional experiences and how they look is to control me and who I am. It doesn't just feel yucky or tiring or boring. It isn't just unpleasant. It feels like living hell, like total confusion and a feeling of being lost or incompetent.
Again, the weight of these sentiments, the rawness of them cannot be ignored. It's time for educational practice to reflect our knowledge from the research and our knowledge from the voices of autistic individuals. And when we do that, we need to rethink this focusing on extinguishing behavior, on control and compliance, because the voices of autistic adults are also very clear about the very real, dangerous, and damaging outcomes of such a focus.
But in my view, if you want to change the outcome, you have to change the environment, not the individual themselves.
Really talking about the importance of partnership and understanding best practice in education for autism, and making sure that we as educators, as therapists, as people who care about autistic individuals are listening to and understanding their perspective and their experience and supporting them in authentic, meaningful ways versus kind of imposing outside structure on them.
This is the way that I organize how I think about things, and this is what I'll start with and go from there as we go along. Yes, I am autistic, and I do research and evaluation of programs and of policies, so this is quite an invitation. When I think about the notion of neurodiversity and assessing whether it is evident in current ASD interventions, and if so, then to what degree, there is so much to consider, so much that I do see. I have come to the conclusion that it is very evident in current interventions neurodiversity does present, in a sense that our best practices are really a reflection of how starved our current tactics are for some neurodiverse injection. When I look at interventions designed to teach or to support, it's unfortunate, but it's true, so I'm not sorry to report that a majority of interventions are at best misguided and at worst degrading, and they don't even try to hide it. Let's talk about misguided, because I think it's really common, where goals and aims and programming are all what staff and mom want. It's not to say these humans don't have some good intentions, but most of you are operating from neurotypical conventions, from norms and your experience, from what you find effective. Ironically, it's all of you that need to learn to take perspective. Autistic people have different brains that are different in their wiring, and functioning in a same brain world is challenging and it's tiring. The world was made for NT brains and made by them too. The world was made by and for people with brains like you. Too much of current practice aims to make different look the same, but I assure you different things work better for supporting different brains.
Believe it or not, there are different people who have been all the way through school. The neurodiverse and autistic communities should be our greatest tool. They have knowledge and experience. They share aspects of profiles with students who are in school now, and they know what was worthwhile and what was damaging to them and what was so much better. So educational practices should be conceptualized together. If you think things have improved and there's truly collaboration between neurotypicals and autistics and all this positive innovation, then I ask you to consider the last time you, your class, your school, or district saw input about programming directly from autistics. If you don't know, or you know it's never, what evidence do you have then to say that things are much improved from the past and what they have been? Best practices have long been biased by a neurotypical mindset, and judgment of what progress is has been based on our compliance to norms and to the status quo to make us look like you do, so that positive outcomes for autistics are essentially being untrue to who we are and how we think and our natural inclinations, and we know that this has very serious mental health implications. I saw a quote the other day by an autistic advocate asking educators to consider who does benefit from therapy and interventions. Is it the student who's supported, or is it you who feels so good when task completion has been rewarded? If it is the latter, I assure you change is likely needed. We can learn to act and pass, but that facade will always beat us. In the end, we fall apart because we have only learned to act. We haven't learned to navigate the world with our personhood intact. So why am I out here rhyming, putting all my thoughts in prose? It's really a perfect example of what my own past truly shows. I have always had an easier time expressing myself in writing, and rhyming provides a pattern scheme. There's comfort in the timing. So I think when I can focus on the structure and the flow, it eases my amped up energy around words and how to know if what I'm saying is what I mean, and if I can portray it just as clear as in my head when out loud I need to say it. So in school, I would often change assignments without asking, without permission. Like writing essays as rhyming poems was a commonplace decision. My teachers never told me I was being difficult or non-compliant. They encouraged it or built it in. I was creative, not rigid and defiant. This was so empowering. True to me, I could complete the task without going along to get along, without wearing a burdensome mask. It fit within the rubric, it was completed without a token, and the message I received was not that I was difficult or broken. Rhyming for a research panel is not the norm or expectation, but show of hands, who out there is still getting information? You see, differences aren't deficits, but we often treat them as they are, and interventions that focus on this will never take us far. Not you, not me, not kids today, not those who have endured it. And now I pass the mic, I'm out, and you can tell them where you heard it.
I yield after that. I knew that was coming, and I'm talking after Jacquelyn by design, mostly to admit that I do need to yield. Some of you may know that Jacquelyn and I do have a partnership together. It's called Autism Level Up. It's our joint venture in all things autism and consulting and thinking about advancement in the field. And I can honestly say it is some of the best work that I have ever done. And I say that having a significant history working in the field, both in research and in development of educational practices. And it's the partnership that's been truly enlightening to me, to be able to work day in and day out with the neurodiverse perspective. Now, I can say that I didn't know how much I was missing before, even though I thought I was informed, that I thought I was being conscientious, that I was respectful. And I was all of those things, but I was at a different level than I am now. And even before we formed this partnership, I had plenty of autistic friends. I've worked with many families with autistic children. But this true collaboration has taken my work to an entirely different place. Now, with that being said, yes, I am also the co-author of the CERTS model, and I will say that that intervention model in and of itself was designed to embrace neurodiversity, and neurodiversity as we knew it when we wrote it, and as a place for where we need to grow, right? So as more information comes to light, more research comes to light in terms of different learning styles, in terms of different brains, that we're incorporating that in our intervention and helping those children to uncover who they truly are and be able to navigate the world and have the tools that they need to be able to do so. So I will say again that CERTS, if we go back and look at those questions, it is grounded in the embracing of neurodiversity. We often talk about CERTS being initiated around Barry Prasant's dissertation in the 1970s when he looked at the functions of echolalia and said, this isn't psychotic speech, it isn't something that needs to be extinguished, it's something that demonstrates a different learning style and something to be worked with. And I think that's where CERTS really has its roots, is honoring and understanding the differences in the learning styles of autistic individuals and moving forward with those. I'm also very excited as more research is coming out now about helping us understand these different learning styles and these different ways of being that we can infuse that, incorporate that in CERTS and level CERTS up to that next place too.
Another area that's important to address is behavior plans. Token economy, focus on compliance-driven programs and how they can be potentially dangerous and damaging, and in some cases creating post-traumatic stress syndrome to autistic individuals.
Two results emerge. One, anxiety increases, and two, there's internal damage due to our communication not being honored, and strong emotions like rage, SIBs, room destruction, or suicidality.
These lived experiences of enduring educational programs which focus on behavior management and focus on trying to make someone appear indistinguishable despite their unique neurology need to become a thing of the past. We need to move forward. So the question becomes, what's the shift? If behavior management isn't the way, what is? The shift is one from behavior management to emotional regulation. We're going to take the focus off of that observable, autistic, STIMI behavior and focus on the unique underlying experience of the individual with autism, fraught with those risk factors and that intensity of reaction. And we're going to embrace that neurodiversity. And we're going to move away from management, this external locus of control, where I'm putting some arbitrary plan in place to control your behavior, to make it look like you fit in. And I'm going to shift that to regulation. Regulation is a developmental construct where we teach individuals with autism new tools and strategies to be able to navigate their days successfully, to regulate those strong emotional reactions. So we move away from behavior management, this external locus of control, to emotional regulation, a focus on skill development within the autistic individual. And in that way, we empower them. We empower them to navigate their days successfully. And when we do so, we maximize their potential.
It is vitally important to remember that autistic people are not a collection of behaviors to be modified, but rather individuals to support, so that we can use the strengths that they have to lead fulfilling and productive lives and to make that the rule rather than the exception.
In response to our students and colleges reaching out to us for guidance and information about managing stress and the university environment, we are delighted today to have Dr. Amy Laurent and Dr. Jacquelyn Fede from Autism Level Up. Their philosophy is that through education, accessible resources, and practical strategies, and a commitment to consistently incorporating the experiences and perspectives of autistic people, they can support the leveling up of society when it comes to autism and neurodiversity.
A lot of times when we start to think about our days and how they break down and how we spend our time and what activities are regulating for us versus what is more challenging and stressful and might need some coping strategies, we kind of think about them in percentages. And that's why these pie charts are flying across your screen right now, because nobody quite knows how their pie chart is going to break down, what it's going to look like. And so you could say, well, what does a typical third level day look like? But now it's what should it look like versus what is it going to look like in the context that you're in? One of the things that we're going to emphasize, whether not so much through the slides, but we'll talk a lot about, is you need to make sure that you keep those activities in your life that you know are truly regulating for you to be a big chunk of your pie. So I know the font is really small on your screens, but that yellow chunk, that play and leisure chunk, those are the things that fuel you. You need to make sure that you schedule those in your day in any way that you can, because that's going to give you the energy to need to cope or in a more challenging situation. So all of this to say, this disruption and this unpredictability is going to create dysregulation. We know it. So what's going to counter that as self-knowledge and self-advocacy? And as Jacquelyn said, we want to make sure that you've got some tools that we're talking about that you feel like you're armed with, so to speak, so that you can like kind of charge in and counter that. So that's where we're headed.
Yeah, I think so much of this is so unpredictable. So the more you can know the core of yourself and understand that, the more you'll be able to apply it every time that situation does change. Like if we have that foundation of, I know my own needs, and then you can also transfer them onto different situations, that in itself is empowering. So that's kind of where we have our focus today, is kind of how do you build your own profile and have it available to you, so that as this situation, like kind of the one predictable thing is that things are going to change all the time.
So what we really want to start with is making sure that people understand that we have a whole suite of tools on our website and our Facebook page, which are both Autism Level Up, that you can download for free and use. So any of the things that you're seeing here today, you can quickly get to through our Facebook page or our website, and you can download them and fill them out for yourself. Because for some of you, this might be a really familiar way to think about your needs in terms of regulation and energy and just being able to feel comfortable in navigating your environment. And for some of you, it might be newer. So what we want to do is try to give you a framework to maybe focus and organize some of what you know about yourself. And so the first place that we start in our work is using this concept of energy. This is actually a language that we've adopted and we use between the two of us. We need to do to support each other. But you'll see that on one side of this, it says the energy needed for the activity. And that's going to be a critical piece for all of your third level students to identify as, in this activity, what kind of energy is going to be the most productive and the most supportive of active engagement, right? Versus in a classroom setting, oftentimes people will anticipate that we should be in a focused and purposeful state, or maybe settled and calm. And when you're going to bed at night, we need to get too sleepy and still so we can stay there. So, so the left side is really, what energy do you need for the activity? It's an interesting exercise to go across your day. Once you have identified what activities you're doing, go across your day and figure out which energy fits with which activity. So this is a tool that we kind of conceptualize when we know there's a need to shift. It's important for us to identify how big of a need there is to shift it.
Right, and I think it's so important that it is visual, because you can, have your arrow on my energy side and have your arrow on your energy needed side and see visually how big of a gap is there between where I am right now and where I need to be able to engage in this activity that I want to do or need to do.
All right. So one of the other things that's really important, and this is kind of moving us towards our real conceptual understanding of this energy, is that a lot of times people assume when we're well-regulated, we're calm. And we kind of just covered that we're not. If it's a soccer or football practice, we're going to be in that amped up and fidgety. If it's before bedtime, we want to be in sleeping and still. And hopefully if it is, we should hit a sleep and stay there as well. So energy is going to shift across our day. And I think that's a really important takeaway for the students listening to think about, because so many times I think we're just drilled to think that calm is the right state to be in. And it's not. That's not going to be functional at all if you're in goal and you're trying to block.
No, actually, I am probably the most settled and calm and goal.
Well, true. And yes, you are, but it's like laser focus. Yeah, focus. So I think that idea of moving away from this goal, no pun intended because there's no pun, but of being calm and helping your students recognize that calm isn't the right place to be all the time. And having the permission to not permission, but just having the knowledge that you need this flow of energy across your day, and understanding which types of activities match which types of energy levels is critical. And especially looking at those things that you say are regulating the play and leisure, like what energy levels are those? Are those on the lower side, or are those on the higher side of the energy level that you seek out? So the next piece of this is really, once you get to this idea that calm is not our goal. Our goal is to make sure our energy matches the activities that we're engaged in. And that can be honoring the fact that we're going into a new classroom with a new teacher, with new students, and that is an ampy kind of experience. The next part is to say, my energy, what it looks like for me, is not maybe what you might expect or think. Because a lot of times we think about things like maxed out and frenzied, and we have this neurotypical impression of what the physical presentation of that is, or even what it feels like to the person. And that's not necessarily true. So being able to not just develop an awareness of that, but really accept that you're not trying to fit in a mold. Right. Your expression doesn't have to be what somebody else thinks it's going to be.
And letting people in when you have your own self-knowledge of what that really looks like and feels like to you, letting your partners who you are in contact with most often know what that looks like, so that they are able to provide better support, is also really helpful. And just as an example, like no matter what state I'm in, I'm pretty much extremely smiley for everything. So it's true. People will often not recognize when I'm really dysregulated, right? Unless you know me.
She has different smiles for different things. So as part of this kind of conceptualization of energy and thinking about matches and mismatches in the environment, that next step of that awareness and acceptance of not thinking you need to fit into a mold, but identifying what the energy looks like for you and being able to convey that to other people. Again, that's the start of that advocacy. We have a tool on our website and Facebook page called My Energy, where you can actually go through these 6 different states. And then the other side is what it feels like. So, if you've got the 3rd level students who are able to express themselves and put it in writing and to be able to convey what that feels like, it's really powerful information to provide to partners. Because I know when you did this,
it's extremely empowering, because it was really the first time in my life where I was telling other people what it looks like and feels like for me, rather than them trying to teach me what some energy state should look like, what's the indication I should give when I am happy or sad or excited. So this was really empowering, because it's just flipping that script and asking someone, what's it like for you? What's your experience? So I know, rather than what this should look like, you need to change. So it's a great exercise to work through if you are autistic, or if you are close to someone who is autistic and you support them. This is a great.
And I think one of the things for me, when you worked through it and you shared it with me, was I was pretty familiar with what it looked like for you, but for you to tell me what it felt like in your body just gave me a whole new appreciation of what your experience was. And I knew you needed support, but it took those needs to a higher level. Or prioritization. So I think, again, these tools where we start to carve out this concept of energy, you'll see how they apply when we start thinking about context. But if you can give people this background knowledge so that when you get into a situation where there is an energy mismatch, somebody is at the ready with tools to support you or to give you the space you need to support yourself. All right. One of the things that's so important for us to understand is regulation is a super complex process, right? So when we're talking about being able to be well-regulated or actively engaged or feel comfortable and confident in our environment, regardless of where our energy level is, but just have a good match, we have to be honest about all of the things that are impacting it. And if we're honest about all the things that impact our energy, we start to understand why those simple strategies don't often work for individuals. It's not that they don't ever work for somebody, but they don't often work more times than not. And it's because of this complexity. So there are many, many factors that are going to impact where your energy is at any given moment. And that's what this tool really highlights, is your person. This is you. This is who you are and how you experience the world. So this tool is really meant to be, as Jacquelyn said, kind of the foundation and the constant that you take and apply to other situations. So there's going to be a range of experiences. Like you'll see one of the boxes we have here is communication. Obviously, there are times that Jacquelyn is very verbal, like today. But in times of extreme stress, she's also very situationally mute, or can be.
And when you combine that with my social box, I can talk forever about topics about which I'm passionate and love, and there's meaning and it's information that I'm relaying onto an audience. But if I am in an unstructured social situation, one, I have zero desire for that, and two, it amps me up to no end.
So the goal of this sheet, and again, totally downloadable for free from our website and Facebook page, is to sit either yourself and work through it, or sit with somebody who supports you and really think about who you are as a person from a physiological standpoint. And you want to think about it from both risk and protective factors. So where do you see kind of the chinks in your armor, so to speak, but where's your strength as well? You want to be able to carve both that out. So physiological, anything from sleep to nourishment, health, interoception, sensory, where do you have those heightened senses? Where do you have fluctuations in that? That's going to be really informative when we start thinking about context, right? Because we need to put your sensory profile in the context that you're expected to exist within. And is there a match? So if you're sensitive to sound, but you're going into a library, that's a good match. But if you're sensitive to sound and you're going into a parade downtown, that's maybe a really bad match. And then the motor pieces, so muscle tone, coordination, endurance, preferences. Cognitive, we get into things like executive functioning, around decision-making, processing. Social understanding is a huge one here for people.
Reliance on routine and predictability, very important for this specific time period.
Right, and
always.
Right, but also to be able to identify that in your whole context, like where of your whole person, where does that fall? Like, is that a huge protective factor when you have that? And it's a huge risk factor when you don't. I mean, one of the things we often talk about for you, if we look at all of these and all of your risk and protective factors, sleep is one of your biggest ones, right?
And I just also want to say, when we say risk and protective factors, on this part, you're really not thinking like that. You're just thinking of what it is. Like, I am super sensitive to smells.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's the environment or the activity that either will make that a risk factor or a protective factor for me. Because there are times I can use that as a regulating thing, and where scent will soothe me and bring on really visual and very pleasant memories. And there's times when I'm in an environment where that will amp up my energy. This is just who you are. Who you are is not inherently a risk or protective factor.
Good point.
It's when you apply it to the
you are correct
situation. I know. I am. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. But just what we want to do to be able to really form this advocacy around your regulation needs is to identify this profile. And again, there's going to be a range, because for Jacquelyn, she can talk about being verbal in the communication, but she can also talk about being situationally mute at times. So people don't expect her ability to be the same all the time. So this is a constant, but it's a constant that can fluctuate. Right. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And then, do you want to talk about, you introduced this a little bit already.
Yeah, I love this support because, yes, we are going to focus on the person, and we want to know the person as well as possible. And we want that person to have as much self-understanding as possible, because that knowledge is so powerful and so empowering. And it's the foundation for advocacy. But we also want it very explicit that at the most, we're putting 1/3 of the onus on the autistic person. We also need to look at the environments in which they exist and the activities in which they have to, need to, and want to partake. And so I think so often the burden falls on autistic people to make changes or use strategies and use tools. And that's great. We want them to have strategies and tools to use.
Absolutely.
But I also will always emphasize, I am really self-aware through my journey and working with Amy. I am very aware of my needs, my profile, all of this. But there are times where I'm like, I can't use another strategy. I can't always be the one to bust out my tools and my strategies. Sometimes things have got to give. So even if you're someone who's very aware and you have a lot of tools and strategies, but you find yourself absolutely drained or exhausted at the end of the day, you might take a look at the balance. Where are the accommodations for you happening? Because it shouldn't be all on you. So as the autistic person. Right. And, if you see that as a staff or a partner too, where this person is a rock star and it's really easy, you think it's very easy to be with them, really evaluate what are the activities, what are the environments, and how often, how much of the time am I asking them to use some kind of strategy rather than maybe making a simple change in the environment that could take a lot of burden off of them. So this is like an explicit reminder that we need to look at how that profile lines up with the environment and the activity across these same domains. And if we find a huge mismatch, we need to target our strategies and our accommodations in that domain.
Institutionalized anti-autism within society, but I think that is at a subconscious level. I don't think people are horrible deliberately, but I think that there's this permeation of negativity and treatment of autistic people almost automatically as lesser that has the same impact as that sort of parallel with institutionalized racism. Yeah. So, in terms of autistic safety, I'm not talking about things like consent and abuse and that sort of safety. I'm talking more of a kind of conceptual level. So I hope to share some thoughts about what it might mean to feel safe as an autistic person. We'll be allowed, in inverted commas, to feel safe in our own world, within society.
I suppose one thing that I tend to always say is find a safe space or a safe person for moments of overwhelm. Make sure that you have that safe space that you can exit that nightmare sensory situation in order to kind of re-regulate yourself. And the other thing that I kind of say to people as well is society is finding a society where your interest lies. Like if you're interested in public speaking, going to like you speak about soccer and about having this automatic social circle, that was because it is your special interest. Do you know what I mean? So it's about people utilising those special interests as well, I suppose.
I think those are great points. The safe space is a wonderful idea, and I think it's also very feasible for people to be able to find that. And then finding something that you're interested in and that really keeps you engaged in that campus in a way that you're comfortable with is huge. So I think those are brilliant ideas.
People even necessarily feel that they have the right to feel safe, but you do. And we need to be fighting individually, I think, and collectively within, if you like, the autism tribe, or the autistic community, and in a broader way in terms of professional services, parents, friends, partners, all of those sorts of things, to fight for the right to be autistically safe. Because until we've got that right, and that right has turned into a reality, there's still work to do. I'm unaware of any presentation, certainly that I've been at conferences where people have talked about autistic safety. And I think it needs to be part of the autism narrative, if you like, to get people to understand just how unsafe it feels to be autistic on a day-to-day basis in normal society.
Stress is overwhelming, but in the worst of ways. It's like it cannot be contained. It has to come out. And not in words. In fact, I don't really think or experience words when I am stressed. It's a very physical experience. In the midst of it, in a moment where I'm highly stressed, it feels like I'm in this chaotic mayhem and like I need to throw myself full force into a wall or smash things. And in my most stressed times, I do that.
Some of these behaviors sound very familiar to us, things that we might engage in times of intense stress and anxiety. Some of them are less familiar, but they are all grounded in neurological development. It's human nature to seek out repetitive, rhythmic actions, especially paired with pressure, when we experience extreme stress and extreme excitement. We start to understand that the intensity of the experience of an individual with autism calls on these explosive behaviors occurring much more frequently. Given this knowledge, it's time for educational practice to reflect what we know. We know better. We understand risk factors and intensity of experiences. We actually need to be doing better. Again, adults with autism are crystal clear. They challenge us to rethink the status quo of behavior management, trying to make them appear indistinguishable from the neurotypical population, despite the fact that they have a unique neurology. We need to understand the behavior, but understand it within the context of autism. Listen to them and learn from them.
Let go of control.
Don't try to change us. Empower us.
Thank you very much.
So one thing I am very keen to try out to help regulate the nervous system, heal trauma, and reduce stress within and without.
People who've had a ketamine experience will often say that it's a sensation of being profoundly in self. The protectors have unblended, the exiles are up and accepted. We also know from brain scanning that ketamine lights up a part of the brain, which is in the midline structures. If you put your hands together and your thumbs on your forehead, what's just behind your thumbs is called the anterior cingulate gyrus. And that is a part of the brain that lights up when people are using ketamine. And it's we can relate it to anticipation of future pleasure, and activating the ability to anticipate future pleasure is such a key part of treatment of depression, and it's such a key part of being in self as well. It also is a place in the brain that lights up when we're thinking about ourselves, when we represent ourselves to ourselves, our bodies, our minds. And so it's a key part of the brain. It lights up with ketamine. And then during the ketamine episode, journey, it becomes connected through certain kinds of waves to the rest of the brain in a way that's rather unique. Normally, this part of the brain is in a circuit that some people call the default mode network. It's associated with ruminations. People come in, they remind you time and time again, every 30 seconds to a minute, about what they believe about themselves, and you can see this part of the brain being involved in that neural circuit called the default mode network during ketamine. And I suspect when we do these studies during IFS, what we see is an expansion, and that part of the brain becomes connected with the other parts in a more full and vibrant way. Advantages of ketamine are that it's a legal psychedelic. Anyone who can prescribe Schedule 3 drug can prescribe ketamine. Has a rapid onset of benefit, typically by the end of the session. It's short-acting, low cost. The generic form of this medication is extremely low cost, costing something like $4 per dose. The whole treatment session cost is driven mainly by therapy time. Benefit, which is very profound. People can have the first days of non-depressed life that they've had in decades. So profound benefit. But importantly, it encourages and allows and invites the thinking part to rest. And other psychotherapeutic modalities do the opposite. They actually engage that part. And that's useful in some settings. In the ketamine setting, resting that part is so beautiful and so important for getting into self and hearing from the exiles. Ketamine welcomes self-qualities, particularly clarity, confidence, and connection. Ketamine's acting on a different receptor. It's acting on the glutamate receptor, not the serotonin receptor. And the glutamate receptor is the most abundant receptor in the brain, and it is involved in mood. And I've also become convinced in my work that hope is absolutely essential. Too often, people who have been suffering for decades are told that we can work together and maybe it'll make a little difference for you, but maybe not. And it'll all depend on how much work you can actually do. And telling someone who's exhausted that that's it's just hard. And I love the way IFS really starts with hope. We can do better. We can fix this. We can heal this. And people coming into ketamine who believe that they can be healed are healed. It gives people an experience of self, and for some, it's the first really time where they've been able to be in self. There is a dissociative phase that lasts about 90 minutes, sometimes only 60, and it's a time where the protectors are resting, maybe asleep. And so during this time, we leave people to themselves for the most part. It's an inward journey. Later, they'll tell us about abstract images of unburdening. They may float freely into spaciousness. There will be mystical experiences, sometimes ecstatic experiences. Rarely, with ketamine, it can be a difficult journey with profound sadness and despair and pain. Interestingly, as people come out of those most difficult journeys, which again are rare with ketamine, they feel better. They feel confidence that they've never had before in their life. And I've become convinced that it's been an exile, that's been very exiled, that's been seen by a self in those journeys, and the self was able to see the trauma and not be re-traumatized. And that leaves them, after the whole thing, with a profound sense of confidence and healing. Most ketamine journeys are, I would say, blissful. 90 minutes we spend for coming back into the body. The protectors come back, still unblended though. Anxiety, depression, and pain return softly. Parts can sit across from each other and have conversations. We've had beautiful conversations with people's inner critic or their inner fear, and conversations that they've never had before because they've always been so tightly blended with those parts. Sometimes there's a retrieval and unburdening during that process. It can often take a very spontaneous form. In the last 30 minutes, we check in with protectors who, toward the end of the session, have come back, and they may have questions and concerns about what just happened. They may think that it's silly, or that it doesn't make any sense, or that whatever was seen was maybe unimportant. And so we work with them to reassure those parts that what happened today was important and the healing is real. The integration is critical for sustaining the benefits of ketamine, which I said before, may last only 1 to 10 days if you don't do integration. And so we use IFS for integration. Starts the day after with a call. We recall events and images, foster inner conversations that started, and emphasize that what happened during your journey was important. The same kinds of things that you do when you're helping people integrate after an IFS session that's been very profound. We do the same with ketamine. More we're seeing people use lozenges or intranasal ketamine. It is available to the body through these routes. This allows for low dose sessions, which are hard opening and allow unblending with protectors. Rarely can be addictive, but we're not seeing that in our supervised clinical practices.
So one of my favorite stims is stargazing. It does overlap with a passion. I love the solar system and outer space. I even love it from like a mythology standpoint and how the solar system and the plants have been interpreted by past cultures and civilizations, all of it. So it definitely overlaps. I have a special interest, but there's also a very unique feel for me when I watch stars. When I look up at the sky and see them sparkling, it almost feels like I have a mirrored map reflected within me, and I can feel them as they glisten and glimmer.